spinal affliction, like other physical problems, can have a range of causes. But in this case, Jesus specifically addresses the spiritual dimension behind it. If you look at the text, that's exactly what the text says. Building on decades of collected empirical research, modern medicine offers an increasingly high rate of cures, as we all know. But at the same time, health professionals also often recognize the emotional and spiritual components in healing. In fact, those things are vital. A majority of the world's cultures also believe in active spiritual as well as physical forces at work in the healing process. But in the midst of this, and this is the story that follows about the Sabbath, and it's quite jarring. In the midst of this, an expert on the law debated whether healing was allowed on the Sabbath if one's life was not at stake. Now, before the temple's destruction in 70 AD, many synagogue leaders probably followed this stricter approach that prohibited healing on the Sabbath. Yet Jesus applies no medicine. He merely lays hands on the woman and he declares her healed. Because God does the work, even the strictest synagogue leader should not have argued against this healing. And the gospel writers really holding up this example of what we call the shadow side or the dark side of religion, and we see it in all religious traditions, not just here. As Jesus notes, his critics would untie their animal on the Sabbath to water it. How much more should this daughter of Abraham be released on God's special day? But again, lest we be too judgmental today, we need to recognize that, the history of Christianity is permeated with this kind of attitude and thinking. And even today, some Christians follow tradition so strictly that they care more about detailed rules than they care about human need. Of course, some rules are important, but we risk taking pride in our strict observance, or even in strictly avoiding being like such strict people, instead of remembering that we all need God's grace. Although through much of history, Christians have taken the lead in building hospitals, some Christians have emphasized only taking care of the soul. But the latter approach owes more to Plato than it does the Bible. Jesus' ministry repeatedly shows that God cares deeply about our physical health, that God wants us to be healthy and whole and vital. Those who work, therefore, to improve people's health, whether by research or treatment or prayer, care about and labor for a cause that is very dear to God's heart. This is a part of what I'm calling this morning God's dream for the world, God's dream for each of us, health and wholeness. And this health and wholeness is brought about through liberation and freedom, through restoration. And of course, that's why access to medical care is so important. The great poet Langston Hughes, you may be familiar with Langston Hughes. He was a very important African-American writer in the early part of the 20th century. He's actually from my part of the world in a little town called Fort Scott, Kansas, which is just south of where I grew up in Overland Park. And so when I was a child, we had to memorize Langston Hughes poetry. And this is one of his that applies, I think, to our text this morning. He said, "Hold fast to dreams, for life without dreams is like a bird with a broken wing that cannot fly." Hold fast to your dreams. In the words of Episcopal Bishop Michael Curry, God has a dream. God has a dream, a vision, a plan, a sublime divine purpose for this world. God has a dream for God's creation, a dream for every person, every man, woman, and child, whoever walked upon the face of the earth. And God will not rest until our nightmare, which in biblical terms is described as separation from God, is ended, and God's dream is realized. That's what Jesus was really all about. That's what he came to show us. He came to show us the way to live God's dream instead of a life of separation. He came to show us the way to be truly, authentically, and genuinely human as God intended and created us to be. He came to show us how to become more than simply an individual collection of self-interests. He came to show us how to become the human family of God. And one of the things that you'll notice about all of the healing stories in the Bible is that these people are always ostracized and they are on the edges of the community. The assumption in the ancient world was that the person had done something wrong, something sinful to cause their illness. Jesus always rejects that notion. And the healing is a means to bring them back into the center of the human community, into the center of the human family. And when the world is lived like that, when our lives are lived like that, then children don't go to bed hungry. When the world is lived more in accord with God's dream, God's vision for life, then we will find ways to lay down our swords and our shields, as the old hymn says, down by the riverside, and to study war no more. God has a dream, and God will not rest until God's dream is accomplished. And miraculously, God will not do it without us. Both St. Augustine of Hippo and the late Bishop Desmond Tutu said this: by himself, God won't. By ourselves, we can't. But together with God, we can. We can. God has a dream. And God has called us to help God realize that dream for every person, man, woman, and child who walks the face of the earth. Now, this is important to understand, because if you look at our text from the context, the larger context of Luke's gospel, you'll discover that it's so clear that this woman was experiencing in her personal life the fulfillment of God's dream for her life. It was being lived out right before us. Recall that just a few chapters back, in chapter 4 of the Gospel of Luke, that's where Jesus first begins his ministry, his witness. He identifies himself in that ministry with the famous words of the prophet Isaiah. He stands up in the synagogue and he reads these words which many of us have been hearing all of our lives. Jesus says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because God has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. God has sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty all those who are oppressed, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord." Now notice the sequence in Luke's gospel. Just before Jesus says these words from the prophet Isaiah, he has been baptized by John in the Jordan River, and when he is baptized, he has this powerful vision that the heavens are opened, and he has this incredible vision, and a dove descends. It's a vision of God's dream for his creation of this world, and it's a vision that inspires him and sends him out into the world. But before he can go and proclaim God's dream and vision, he must go out and fast and pray in the wilderness. And there in the desert wilderness, fasting and praying, the devil comes to test him, to see if he will really live the dream, to tempt him to subtly accept the nightmare, to tempt him to subtly buy into the nightmare, to tempt him not to trust the dream. But he resists, And in his resistance, he then leaves the desert and then goes to the synagogue and publicly declares in that synagogue at Nazareth that he will stand with the dream of God. And it is then that he preaches and proclaims the words of the prophet Isaiah again. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me, he says, to preach what? Good news to the poor. This is the dream. He's sent me to proclaim release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty, liberation, freedom, all who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, the year of Jubilee. And that's exactly what he did in miniature for that woman who was bent over in our text this morning, restoring her to healing and wholeness. She's not just physically healed, she's liberated, she's free. She's now able to live a full, purposeful life that she was not able to live before. Friends, liberation, freedom. We who would follow Jesus of Nazareth believe that God has something better in store for the world, and we are God's co-creators in that vision. God has something better in store for every person, every man, woman, and child who's ever walked the face of this earth. God has something better in store for God's creation and for God's world. So, Christian, go forth into that world, proclaim God's dream for us all. Go forth into that world and witness to God's love for us all. Go forth into that world and set the world free from its division and separation, and free it by the dream of God for us all.